The North Atlantic is the most dangerous ocean in the world. The stormiest, iciest, foggiest, even the saltiest. Yet, paradoxically, it is also the busiest and carries more traffic than all the other oceans of the world combined. Small wonder then that the most innovative hulls were built for these waters, and they were all floating superlatives, the largest, the longest, the fastest, and always the most luxurious vessels ever launched. We're on board one of the last great ships built for the North Atlantic. She was originally called the France, and she made her maiden voyage in 1962. She was a hybrid, part Western Ocean express liner and part cruise ship. But in the old days, cruising was a rarity, and all these great ships were exclusively and profitably employed on the North Atlantic. Fuel was cheap, the aeroplane was only an interesting oddity, and each year millions of passengers enjoyed or endured passage to the opposite shore. Crossing by sea was not only a delightful ritual, it was a necessity as well. In 1972, I wrote a book about the North Atlantic ships and the life on board them. It was called appropriately, The Only Way to Cross. And I'd like to share in these programs some of these pages with you. To start at the beginning, we must go back over 140 years.
Regular steam service across this most dangerous ocean was inaugurated in 1840 by a shrewd Scottish-Canadian, Samuel Cunard. He had emigrated to Halifax and was already the head of a successful coastal shipping service. But his eye was on a richer prize, the Admiralty's mail contract between Britain and North America, worth £55,000. In today's money, $250,000 annual subsidy. So Cunard ordered 4 vessels from Wood and Napier, the famous Glasgow builders. "I want a plain and comfortable boat," he specified, "not the least unnecessary expense for show." Napier built him 4, each 1,000-ton, 200-foot, 3-masted bark. Steam engines with a combined horsepower of 450 drove paddle wheels, for propellers were still an experimental novelty. Cunard christened his ships the Britannia, Acadia, Caledonia, and Columbia, names chosen for their Anglo-American appeal, and all ending in the letters IA, a company convention that would continue for nearly a century. To maintain his proposed fortnightly service, Cunard needed a quartet of identical steamships. Every other Wednesday, one would sail from Liverpool. If he missed a sailing, Cunard would be fined. He called his company the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. Everyone else called it the Cunard Line. The Britannia sailed first, on July 4th, 1840. She was only half full, carrying 63 passengers, including Samuel Cunard himself. She made an uneventful 14-day crossing, first to Halifax and then Boston. Grateful passengers on that maiden voyage presented Captain Woodruff with an elaborate silver trophy. It was called the Britannia Cup, a company relic found today in the Columbia dining room of Cunard's current flagship, the QE2. After the frigid winter of 1844, Cunard's American port had to be changed. Boston Harbor froze solid, and although enthusiastic Bostonians cut a channel through the ice for the Britannia, Cunard could not risk delays and switched operations to New York. Manhattan became, for Cunard as well as his competitors to follow, the fixed American terminus for all North Atlantic liners. Only a few indications remain of the Britannia's interiors. This view of the ladies' day cabin decorates a platter from a souvenir china set of the period. The Britannia's most articulate passenger was Charles Dickens, who crossed in January of 1842. The illustrator of his American notes drew the cabin this way, although Dickens had his own description: an utterly impractical, thoroughly hopeless, and perfectly preposterous box. He was a bad sailor and penned on board the Britannia the ultimate 6-word symptom describing seasickness: not ill, but going to be. Although passengers flocked to Cunard's vessels, the cargo that interested him most was the transatlantic mail. This letter was stamped, literally, indicating that postage had been paid in Liverpool, and the writer has specified that it is to be carried on the Britannia. It was a predilection shared by thousands. the Cunard line flourished. By 1850, the fleet had doubled. 10 years later, it doubled again. Sailings took place every week. But speed and splendor were less important than reliability. Samuel Cunard's standing order to his captains made it quite clear. Speed is nothing. Follow your road, deliver her safe, bring her back safe. Safety is all that is required. As the numbers of his ships grew, so did their size and power. Here are the reciprocating engines of the Persia in 1856, a vast power plant that drove Cunard's first iron-hulled liner across the Atlantic in only 9 days, carrying 350 passengers. By the end of the 19th century, sails and paddle wheels had disappeared, and transatlantic hulls had grown even larger. And although Cunard cared about speed now, the Blue Ribbon, the North Atlantic's mythic speed prize, had been lost to rivals across the North Sea. It had passed to a succession of crack German steamships, among them the Deutschland, a four-funneled racer of the Hamburg America line. This was worrisome to the British, for the superiority of their merchant fleet directly affected the Empire's lines of supply, vital factors in the subtle conflict, already a reality at the Admiralty, between Britain and Germany. So a government subsidy was voted in Parliament that would enable Cunard to counter the German lead with 2 new liners. At 30,000 tons each, they would be superliners. Moreover, they were to be powered by a radical new means of propulsion, recently developed by a British engineer called Charles Parsons. Parsons perfected the marine steam turbine. In simplest terms, a turbine is a windmill driven by steam. As opposed to a complex reciprocating steam engine, turbines have only one moving part and are capable of sustaining continuous high speeds. Parsons installed a trio of his turbine engines within a pencil-slim 100-foot hull, which he had christened, in deference to its motive power, the Turbinia. Each of her 3 shafts carried 3 propellers, and she underwent drenching trials in the North Sea off Newcastle. Parsons unveiled his new invention with dramatic showmanship. In the summer of 1897, there would be a naval review in the waters off Southampton in honor of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The Prince of Wales would take the salute of the Royal and Merchant Navies from the bridge of the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert. In secret, Parsons nursed his fragile craft down the east coast of England and concealed her near the head of the reviewing line. As the Royal Yacht started off, Parsons opened the throttles wide. The Turbinia streaked past, under the astonished gaze of the royal party, and, quite stealing the show, roared through the fleet at the incredible speed of 34 land miles an hour. Parsons, the Turbinia, and most significantly, the marine steam turbine had arrived. Massive application followed swiftly. Cunard's new superliners were equipped with turbines. The first of them was the Lusitania, the largest, and as it turned out at once, the fastest vessel in the world. She entered service in 1907, arriving in late summer at Cunard's West 14th Street piers in Manhattan. But the Lusitania was destined to meet a tragic end only 8 years later, and for our purposes, I prefer to dwell on the construction and launch of their nearly identical sister, the Mauretania, which would become Cunard's golden ship. Whereas the Lusitania had been built at John Brown's yard on the Clyde, the Mauretania was laid down at Swan Hunter Wigham Richardson's yard on the River Tyne. This was a view up from the water's edge towards the bow, as ribs and floor plates were assembled to frame the hull. Amidships, the double skin of the coal bunkers take shape, and work on the stern was delayed until the very last moment. The Admiralty and Cunard were still debating the risks of Parsons' revolutionary turbines. Elsewhere in the yard, boilers and funnels were prefabricated, components that would not be installed until after the hull was afloat. By September of 1906, the Mauretania was ready for launching. Poised on the ways, her 4 propellers, a first for this new class, in place. Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess of Roxburgh, had consented to christen her, and en route to the launch platform, a parade of motor cars, 2 abreast, were directed up a wooden ramp through a series of giant steel caverns. These were the Mauretania's funnels on their side. This was an irresistible means of publicizing the ship's incredible dimensions. Squeezing vehicles through funnels became a constant for steamship companies anxious to promote the size of new ships as we shall see. Once through the funnels, visitors were driven by one of Parsons' low-pressure turbine rotors. On the launch platform, Her Grace turned a small capstan as directed. Nothing happened. For Stevenson, the yard manager, had opted to wait a minute longer for high water. The River Tyne was narrower than the length of the Mauretania's hull, and the ways had been constructed diagonally to the river to permit the longest possible launch run. Every inch of depth was critical. Moments later, Her Grace tried again. An electric bell shrilled, and the hull began to move. A launch is one of the most dangerous voyages a vessel makes. The stern floats first and lifts the entire keel, leaving the land-bound portion of the hull balanced on the knife edge of the bows. Hence, a vital part of the launch paraphernalia is a forepoppet, a broad timbered structure that puts a firm base under the bows. The trick involves exquisite timing. The hull must enter the water fast enough to minimize the duration of this delicate condition, yet not so fast as to ram the opposite bank. Drag chains are attached to either side of the hull, U-shaped piles of old anchor cable that tauten on schedule, slowing down the ship the moment she is safely afloat. The Mauretania's launch went like clockwork, and for a year to follow she was fitted out. Turbines, boilers, deckhouses, funnels, lifeboats, paneling, carpeting, all came on board in turn, and the funnels were painted in Cunard's company colors, black tops with brilliant orange-red below. This is the single smokestack of the Franconia in 1956, the year she was scrapped. The funnels are the summit of a ship, whether in port or at sea, and company owners like to make them distinctive and readily identifiable. Cunard had achieved his funnel color by accident. It all began because the Britannia's funnel kept rejecting paint, because there were so few intervening decks between boiler rooms and chimney that the funnel plating overheated, scaling off any of the mid-19th century paints that Cunard put on. So he borrowed a trick from the coastal steamers of his day and brewed a homemade paint of ochre and buttermilk. It went on bright yellow, but the heat of the fires turned it orange-red. Although subsequent funnels were insulated from boiler heat by layers of intervening decks, and later paints adhered better, Cunard retained that particular red ochre shade permanently. Here is the after funnel of the first Queen Elizabeth in the same distinctive shade. In the autumn of 1907, a year after her launch, the Mauretania was ready for trials in the North Sea. Before she made her majestic way downriver, the tiny Turbinia was brought alongside for an historic photograph showing the massive evolution of Parsons' invention. 6 weeks later, the Mauretania sailed from Liverpool. November was a bad month for a maiden voyage. The North Atlantic weather was decidedly uncooperative. At one point, the spare anchor on the ship's forecastle broke loose, and the Mauretania hove to for 3 hours while crewmen grappled to secure it. But out of that ghastly crossing emerged memorable statistics. One day's record run of 624 miles. This was precisely the kind of speed and endurance, regardless of weather, that Cunard and the Admiralty had hoped for. She arrived in New York within minutes of the Lusitania's record time. Ships were driven by coal in those days. The Mauretania burned 1,000 tons each day, so 6,000 tons were loaded for each crossing. In New York, the coal came upriver by barge from Perth Amboy. The ship was boomed out from the pier, and for 36 noisy, dirty, and exhausting hours, quarter-ton scoops were winched up to coaling ports along each of the Mauretania's flanks. When coaling was finished, every ledge, sill, and shelf all over the ship was wiped down by hard-working stewards, regardless of how carefully the interiors had been sealed. This is the boiler room of the Leviathan, and shows a single boiler with its trio of fireboxes below. It was the stoker's back-breaking task in all weather to keep an even 4-inch layer of new anthracite covering the glowing coals. The sailor posing here in his whites is obviously not a stoker. He's much too clean. These are real stokers, the Mauretania Stokers Band, celebrating on the stern after beating the Lusitania's record. But this kind of benevolent horseplay was rare. Stoking was a brutal job, engendering a ruthless breed of men, Liverpool Irish for the most part, who's worked under appalling conditions. The stokehold was the crucible of company ambition. It was all very well for Cunard's board members to mandate a particular service speed for their new express liners, but it was the extraordinarily tough, competent men of the Black Gang who made it happen. But whether Lusitania or Mauretania took the prize mattered little. Important was that it was an all-British show. The Germans were out of the running. Here are the mails, delivered to the fastest ship in the world by horse-drawn wagon. For 22 of her 27 years, the Mauretania would hold the blue ribbon. On sailing day in New York, freshly victualled and cold, with mail and passengers on board, the Mauretania sailed from New York to Liverpool, a reassuring melange of teak, brass, mahogany, coal smoke, and glistening white upperworks. Cunard's great British rival was the White Star Line, founded by Thomas Ismay in 1870. Whereas Cunard opted for dispatch, White Star preferred deluxe. But the phenomenal popularity of the Mauretania and Lusitania impelled them to build their own new breed of steamer. First mention of these ships was made one night after dinner in Belgravia at Lord Peary's house. He was the head of Harland and Wolff, the great Belfast shipyard that built every White Star hull. His guest was Bruce Ismay, son of the founder. After dinner that evening, the two men discussed a new class of ship half again as large as the Mauretania. Even as they talked, both knew that there existed not a launchway, dry dock, or even pier that would accommodate hulls of the dimension they envisioned. In shipbuilding's golden era before 1914, naval architects were the visionaries, leading the way while harbor engineers followed protesting in their wake. The first of the new class was the Olympic. All White Star names end in IC. And on sailing day of her maiden voyage in June of 1911, Peary was on board to confer with Captain Edward J. Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line. Paint crews were aloft, touching up the Olympic's quartet of buff, black-topped funnels. The Olympic-class ships were over 800 feet long, only slightly longer than the Lusitania class, but displacing 15,000 additional tons dead weight. They were broader in the beam, higher out of water, and their hallmark was the lavish amount of space for the first class, enormous public rooms with equally large foyers anticipating them. It was this profusion of space that overwhelmed. And during this period, transatlantic liners were referred to as floating palaces. To move this ponderous bulk at 22.5 knots, 2 knots slower than the Mauretania, 29 boilers were employed, distributed 5 across the boiler rooms, and denying the ship insulating coal bunkers along her flanks. The Olympic's first class provided amenities like squash courts, a small swimming pool, and an extra tariff restaurant. She would cross in 6 days, but as compensation for the slightly slower time, was advertised as the most luxurious vessel in the world. Her first crossing was an unqualified success. Off Staten Island, the new ship clears her immigrant passengers. The paint has flaked off her bow, clear indication of a maiden passage. Up at the White Star piers, the Olympic stern juts out into the Hudson. New York piers had still not caught up with the size of the ships they had to accommodate. During her first year, the Olympic was involved in a freak collision. As she passed down Southampton water en route for New York, a Royal Naval cruiser, HMS Hawke, proceeding on a parallel course, inexplicably turned to port and drove her ram into the liner's starboard after quarter. No one was hurt. The ship was withdrawn and taken back to Belfast for repairs. But it seemed a curiously unhappy omen for the White Star Line's new superliner. The second of the class was the Titanic, scheduled to sail on her maiden voyage a year later. The posters advertising her debut utilized, in fact, a photograph of the Olympic. Although it may seem pedantic to quibble about which ship was which, within a year it became of paramount interest to responsible newspaper editors, for the Titanic would founder on her maiden voyage, and distinguishing one ship from the other became of supreme interest. There is a simple way to tell the difference, for Bruce Ismay had suggested that the Titanic have the forward end of her promenade deck glassed in to protect first-class passengers during winter crossings. Here is the Titanic proper. Note the line of windows under the number 1 funnel. After trials in Belfast Lock, she entered the new dry dock, especially constructed for the new class. She was triple screwed, with only her center propeller driven by a turbine. These Belfast workers, posing proudly under the Titanic's stern, could have no conception that within a fortnight that same perspective would be silhouetted against a mid-Atlantic sky. Sailing day, Southampton, April 10th, 1912. The new White Star giant passes down the Solent toward the Channel, her splendid image captured by Dickens, the Cowes druggist, who made a hobby of photographing every new ship to use the port. Despite her bulk of 45,000 tons, the Titanic's designers had retained a striking yacht-like grace. From broadside, these ultimate Harland and Wolff hulls carried their displacement well, in striking contrast to the comparative German hulls that followed. Near the Nab Tower, Bowyer, the pilot, disembarked, and after a call at Cherbourg and Queenstown, the second of the Olympic class sails for New York. This amateurish little sketch was drawn by a man named Frederick Fleet, one of two lookouts posted in the Titanic's crow's nest just before midnight of Sunday evening, April 14th. He drew it from memory many years after the sinking in an attempt to show how distant the iceberg was when he first saw it. It seems doubtful that he had seen it that far off. There was no moon, but everyone later remarked on the extraordinary brilliance of the stars that shone right down to the horizon. Had Fleet and his watchmate been posted on the bow rather than in the crow's nest, he might have seen it earlier, silhouetted against the sky. Moreover, the calmness of the sea was against him, for icebergs read black at night, and without any waves there was no telltale line of white breakers around the base. So Fleet spotted it too late. He rang the bridge, and Murdoch, officer of the watch, instantly reversed engines full astern, and at the same time hard astarboarded. In those days, this meant that the Titanic was turned hard to port. Murdoch hoped that he would just miss the iceberg, and to many it seemed that he had. It was a close thing. The Titanic's starboard shrouds shaved off tons of ice that toppled into the forward well deck, where immigrant passengers played football with fragments of it. But an underwater spur of ice delivered the coup de grace, slicing a 300-foot gash along the Titanic's underwater plating and admitting a fatal inundation of freezing green Atlantic seawater into no less than 6 forward compartments. Far better that Murdoch had kept on course and rammed the iceberg. 1, 2, or even 3 forward compartments might have been holed, and the prow might have been crumpled like tinfoil, but the ship doubtless would have remained afloat. But Murdoch, like any of us, automatically strove to avoid collision altogether, even though it was common knowledge on the Western Ocean that ramming an iceberg was preferable to side-swiping it. On that cold April night, there were 2,200 souls on board RMS Titanic. Now, souls is a maritime collective indicating the numbers of combined passengers and crew on board. Souls never travel in planes, trains, or buses, only on ships. Of that total, 1,500 were to perish. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was on board, and it was he who informed Bruce Ismay and Commodore Smith during a bleak conference on the bridge that the ship had only 2 hours before she would sink. In fact, she stayed afloat for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Passengers, unaware of any urgency and only half-heartedly encouraged to abandon ship, seemed loath to exchange the light and warmth of the Titanic and commit to the chill discomfort of a small boat. The brilliantly lit Titanic lay dead in the water at the margin of an enormous ice field, ice unusually far south for that time of year, and ice about which the Titanic had received 6 radioed warnings from other ships in her path. The purser mustered the ship's orchestra, who, clad in overcoats and lifebelts, played cheerful ragtime selections. Women and children only were allowed into the boats. Husbands, fathers, and sons stayed behind, trying to keep their footing on the increasing slope of the decks. Commodore Smith, ultimately responsible for the ruinous speed which the Titanic had maintained through the ice, went down with his ship. The lights burned to the very end, the heroic, selfless work of the engineers. The field of purple that British engineering officers wear to this day between the gold rings of their rank is in memoriam for the Titanic's brave engineers, not one of whom survived. The 700 passengers and crew in the lifeboats pulled away from the ship as she upended, looking like the Flatiron Building, one New Yorker commented, just before the final plunge. Crewmen in charge of the boats urged them to row, fearful that they would be dragged down with the ship. But a baker, dosed liberally with whiskey against the cold, rode the ship down like an elevator, clutching onto the poop railing and stepping off into the water without even getting his head wet. So much for the dreaded suction. More likely, those half-laden lifeboats rowed away from the wreck to avoid the hundreds of their fellow souls who floated, freezing and dying, their heartbreaking cries continuing in ghastly diminuendo for nearly an hour. Next morning at dawn, the gallant little Cunarder Carpathia was first to reach the scene, plucking 700 from the boats and taking them back to New York. Before she arrived, there was rumor aplenty. At the offices of the New York American, a chalkman writes up the names of celebrated passengers. Names like Widener, Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss, and Ismay would become common currency in the weeks that followed. The Evening Sun perpetrated the cruelest reassurance, prompting anxious relatives to organize a special boat train for Halifax. Somewhere in the middle of the Maine woods, it was flagged down when the awful truth became known. After the tragedy, London Sphere reviewed the history of crossing the Atlantic. Prior to the 17th century, there had been no communication. Then sailing ships made it across in 45 days by the 17th century. To the present, crossing time had been reduced to 5 days by the Mauretania. As a prophetic fillip, the editors of the Sphere predicted that someday, even an aeroplane might manage to fly across in a day or so. The British Board of Trade regulations governing the numbers of lifeboats carried on the Titanic were archaic, dating from 1894. Vessels of over 10,000 tons, it was written, were obliged to carry 16 lifeboats. No provision was made for vessels of 45,000 tons. The rules, like the piers and dry docks, had been outstripped by the size of the ships. Here is the Mauretania's boat deck, pre-April of 1912, with a long blank space between clusters of the obligatory 16 lifeboats. After the Titanic, all that would change. The first new liner in New York Harbor after the Titanic's abortive maiden voyage was the France, the French line's first and only four-stacker. She was festooned with lifeboats, life rafts, floats, a sensible proviso of a seat in a lifeboat for every single soul on board. One of the Titanic's most gallant passengers was Benjamin Guggenheim. As the last lifeboats were leaving the ship, Guggenheim appeared on deck, accompanied by his valet. He was resplendent in white tie and tails. "We are dressed in our best," he observed calmly, "and prepared to go down like gentlemen." Dressing up for a special occasion was an Edwardian ritual ashore, and it made sense to extend it to shipboard life as well. And we do the same by dressing for meals in the evening. After all, it makes good sense, for overeating has always been the transatlantic passenger's favorite sport. In fact, some of them were advised never to eat anything they couldn't lift. Now, in my next program, we'll discuss Kaiser Wilhelm's favorite ship, and we'll also have a look at life on board during the 20s. But now, I see it's time for me to go down to dinner dressed in my best. One of the essentials of an ocean voyage anywhere is this neat, compact space we call a cabin. There are 1,000 of them on the Norway, and as in every cabin in which I've ever sailed, there's something distinctive about each and every one of them. Someone once said of their cabin on the Aquitania that it smelled of 3 things: soap, flowers, and the sea. With air conditioning, we can no longer open the portholes, so the sea smell is gone. But evocative sounds remain, the tremor of the turbines below, as well as the restless murmuring of the ship as she sails through the ocean. I'm very pleased that the
cabins on the Norway have bunks and portholes. Some time ago in our story, there was a shipping man who wanted to abolish them because he felt they were old-fashioned. That was in 1912, and the shipping man in question was Albert Baleen, head of Germany's Hamburg America line. He was very envious of the White Star Line and wanted his ships to be as splendid as those of his British rivals. So he banished from all cabins all bunks and portholes, substituting in their place brass beds and interior window casements. In the process, he reduced his cabins to the anonymous banality of hotel rooms. Now, ships are not merely floating hotels for two very good reasons. First, hotels only cater to one class of visitor, whereas ships accommodate rich and poor alike. Secondly, once a crossing had begun, there was no possible way you could check out. Keeping this distinction firmly in mind, let us see how the ships of the Hamburg America line were built.
Only 2 months after the Titanic went down, an even larger vessel was launched across the North Sea. She was Kaiser Wilhelm II's favorite ship, perhaps because her name, the Imperata, means emperor in Latin. He exhibited a great personal interest in her construction, the first of a new class, and, astonishingly enough, the first superliner to be built in Germany. Prior to that time, German shipping companies went shopping for their vessels in Britain, usually to Holland and Wolff. For the Hamburg shipwrights to have produced a trio of 50,000 tonners within the space of 2 years was a formidable achievement. The Imperata was the first of a trio of Imperata-class ships. Her two successive sisters would be called Vaterland and Bismarck. The Kaiser was to christen the Imperata, and whereas the Duchess of Roxbury had stood on a sloping platform under the bows of the Mauretania, a special two-story launch structure was built for His Majesty. On launch day, the Kaiser must have been rather out of breath. Having clambered up to the first level, shaken hands with all the silk hats and spiked helmets, before clambering up to the little cupola above, in company with Albert Baleen, head of the Hamburg America line. Two embarrassing incidents occurred that day. First, a piece of scaffolding fell from the bow, nearly hitting the Kaiser. For a moment it seemed that he had been struck, but he had merely leapt back out of the way. A few moments later, he pushed the launch button. A bottle of Moselle, not champagne, swung down on the end of a long steel arm and shattered against the Imperata's stem. The hull began to move. To prevent her from ramming the opposite side of the harbor, the anchors were poised. Once she was off the ways, both were let go quite literally, for someone had forgotten to secure the onboard ends, and both anchors and several fathoms of valuable anchor cable rattled down into the mud of Hamburg harbor. But at least the Imperata was afloat. For a year she was fitted out. Once her double hull was complete, Hamburg's largest fire pumper was loaded on board by crane, so that the space between the two skins could be tested by filling it with water. A new anchor came on board, as well as 6 huge turbines, 4 forward and 2 astern, that had been made in Germany under license from Charles Parsons. 3 enormous funnels, the tallest of their day, were erected atop the sun deck. At the end of the year, she was dry docked to have her rudder installed. When she was completed and ready for trials, she was at once refined, elegant, although somehow cumbersome. On her bow was a preposterous ornament, a scowling eagle, its wings outstretched, its talons gripping a globe on which was inscribed, "Mein Feld ist die Welt," "My field is the world," the motto of the Hamburg America line. It was placed atop a vertical stem, quite clearly without any aesthetic provision having been made to receive it. All the Imperata's eagle accomplished in reality was to lengthen the ship by a critical 18 feet, making it longer than Cunard's Aquitania, fitting out at John Brown's yard on the Clyde. Ship owners were intent on having the longest, if not the fastest ship in the world. Another view of the infamous bird at Hoboken reveals a distressing peculiarity about the Kaiser's favorite ship, with far more serious consequences. She listed terribly, or in the delicate prose of the naval architect, was deficient in initial stability. From the moment she first arrived in New York Harbor, the New York pilots christened her the Limperata. With her bunkers depleted near Crossing's End, and with a breeze on her vast flank, the new German liner leaned alarmingly away from the vertical. This happened simply because Charles Mevez, the Hamburg America's resident architect, had provided such lavish interiors. Low down in the ship was the celebrated Pompeian bath, which he had copied from one he had designed for London's Royal Automobile Club in 1910. It was a monumental fixture, yet located on the lowest deck, its mosaic and marble columns made little difference to problems of stability. The double-decker dining room, huge but restrained, was similarly located well down in the hull. But up on B deck, devoted entirely to stupendous public rooms, Mevez had gone drastically over budget in terms of top weight. The main lounge, or social hall, for the first class was 27 feet high, executed in handsome Louis XVI style. Further forward was the winter garden, and up a flight of marble steps, a lavish extra-tariff restaurant, the Ritz-Carlton. This was an innovation that Mevez and Albert Baleen had perfected on the America 7 years earlier, a restaurant where first-class passengers could book meals at any hour of the day they chose, paying for the privilege. On the America, the Ritz-Carlton had been a special little room tucked out of sight on an upper deck. On the Imperata, the concept was enlarged, and the room featured decoration that raised havoc with the ship's stability. Further aft, the smoking room's real brick-and-mortar fireplace added to stability problems. Even in the most private of rooms, inch-thick marble backsplash, a tub as hefty as a tank, and a toilet that seemed large enough for a bathtub in the second class all added their own crushing weight. It was all this embarras de richesse that made the Imperata into the Limperata. After her first season, during annual dry docking, several modifications were made. Here at Cuxhaven, the profile was indelibly changed. 9 feet have come off the tops of each funnel, and below decks, 2,000 tons of cement were poured into the bilges, and acres of marble came off B deck to be replaced by artificial paneling. Wicker chairs were introduced as well. The only decorative item to remain untouched was the eagle up on the bow, but a hurricane off Cherbourg in 1913 took care of that. A giant wave swept over the bow, tearing off the creature's right wing. The rest of the carcass was removed and never replaced. Albert Baleen's second ship was the Vaterland, launched safely without anchors. On these new German ships, Baleen upgraded accommodations for steerage passengers. Although thousands of his humblest clients never saw the Ritz-Carlton or squash court or swimming bath, they were the most consistently profitable passengers. It was, in fact, the vast westward hegira of immigrants that dictated the enormous size of North Atlantic liners. Before Baleen improved condition, immigrants crossed rather bleakly. This is steerage quarters on La Lorraine, a turn-of-the-century French vessel. The modest little shelf with its straw mattress was, in addition to a bunk, the passenger's chair, closet, bureau, and desk. A nearby table offered indifferent food, where, had he not been clever enough to bring his own cutlery, the passenger might rent it for the crossing. No attempt was made to finish or disguise the naked steel walls of the ship. Up on deck, immigrants crowded together on the hatch covers when the weather was fair and often when it was not. In New York Harbor, vessels carrying immigrants would list as railings along the port side were packed for a glimpse of the legendary Statue of Liberty. Before they boarded, and after they landed, each immigrant was closely inspected for trachoma, the dread eye disease that Napoleon's soldiers had brought back to Europe after the Egyptian campaign. Any immigrant suffering from trachoma was automatically barred from entry into the United States. Baleen decided to upgrade steerage. With millions of prospective passengers, it was a shrewd decision. To begin with, he called it third class instead of steerage. Immigrants were housed in villages along the Elbe, awaiting passage, and were taken by special tenders to the ship. Here, a consignment of third-class passengers boards the new Imperata. Below, they would eat in a proper dining room, waited on by stewards with napkins over their arms. In the modest third-class kitchen, food for over 1,700 passengers was prepared thrice daily. On deck, there was more space and, a lesson learned tragically from the Titanic disaster, a seat for each in a bright red lifeboat. Red boats were easier to spot on a rough ocean. The Imperata holds the Atlantic record for numbers of souls carried on a peacetime crossing. in excess of 5,000 passengers and crew. Landing at Hoboken, passengers from the three classes on board the Imperata lined the wedding cake layers of the ship's forward deckhouse. Third-class deck space, expendable as usual, has been given over to house the luggage of the first and second class. Huge, listing, yet magnificent, this first of the Kaiser's trio of superliners was a memorable ship, and in the 2 years she sailed prior to 1914, she carried thousands of passengers, rich and wretched, between the old world and new. War broke out in August of 1914, and most of the great express liners were instantly converted into giant armed merchantmen. The Aquitania, Cunard's companion ship for the Lusitania and Mauretania, had just entered service the year before. Now she was returned to her fitting-out berth at Liverpool while 5-inch guns were installed on her after end. But it took only a few months to convince the Admiralty that high-speed ocean liners consume ruinous amounts of coal. The ships were speedily demobilized, held in reserve for the job for which they had been designed, the transportation of large numbers of passengers at high speed. The war gave the North Atlantic liners a new look. An artist employed by the Admiralty, Norman Wilkinson, devised a scheme of camouflage known as dazzle painting. Conventional silhouettes were broken up into bizarre patterns and colors, designed to confuse enemy commanders as to the size and course of their quarry. There's no indication that dazzle painting ever really worked, but it was an inexpensive means of reassuring the ship's wartime crews and passengers. These new clients were soldiers in their thousands, bound either for the trenches from America or, tragically, returning home from the Dardanelles as wounded. The Olympic, Mauretania, and France all saw service in the Mediterranean on this vital work. Designated specifically as hospital ships, the liners were painted white, their hulls sporting a green band interspersed with red crosses. Only the medical staff were accommodated in cabins. The wounded were carried in public rooms on the upper decks to make it easier to evacuate them in the event of an emergency. Bunks lined the promenade decks of the France. The Aquitania's handsome Palladian lounge, that would be used as a cinema in the 20s and 30s, became a hospital ward for the wounded men of World War I. A new vessel, completed too late for peacetime, was also pressed into service as a hospital ship. She was the third of the Olympic class, the Britannic. Originally, she was to have been called the Gigantic, but after the loss of the Titanic, White Star's management lowered their sights and used the more prosaic Britannic instead. Incorporating into her were all the lessons learned from the Titanic. Her hull was doubled right up past the waterline, and enormous gantry davits, grouped around funnels 1 and 4, could lower triple stacks of lifeboats over either side of the vessel. But she proved no luckier than her predecessor. On her third trip out to the Dardanelles, she struck a mine in the Aegean and went to the bottom in an hour. Luckily, she was carrying no wounded, and only 24 lives were lost. At the time of her sinking, she was the largest ship in the world. Of all the great White Star trio, only the Olympic was to survive. Also lost was the Lusitania, shown here in an eerily prophetic photograph taken in 1911 off the southern tip of Ireland, called the Old Head of Kinsale. At exactly this location 4 years later, carrying civilians eastbound to Liverpool, she was struck by a single German torpedo. It was an international outrage that is popularly supposed to have brought America into the war. In fact, President Wilson didn't declare war for 2 years. But the wanton destruction of a liner carrying non-combatants brought the impact of total war home to not only the victims and their relatives, but all the Allies as well. After the armistice in November of 1918, the British discovered the third of the Hamburg-America trio, the Bismarck, tied up in Hamburg harbor. She was a semi-derelict. The war had interrupted her fitting out, and many of her internal fixtures had been pirated for their precious metals. Under the terms of the peace treaty, she was awarded to the White Star Line as a replacement, ostensibly for the lost Britannic. By 1922, she had been completed at the expense of Blom & Voss, her German builders. A White Star Line prize crew crossed the North Sea and sailed her back to Southampton. Once there, it took only paint crews half a day to put a black band around the tops of her 3 buff funnels to turn her into the Majestic. The Imperata was handed over as well, first to the United States as the USS Imperata to carry doughboys home. Afterwards, she was awarded to Cunard as a replacement for the Lusitania. Cunard rechristened her the Berengaria, the first Cunarder named after a queen. Queen Berengaria had been the wife of King Richard the Lion-Hearted. At Hoboken, the Vaterland was seized the day that war was declared on Germany, and at the suggestion of Mrs. Wilson, the First Lady, renamed Leviathan. So the war ended. The great irony was that although Germany had lost the war, the Kaiser's trio of superliners had survived intact. But they did not survive the Treaty of Versailles. All three were handed over to the victors as prizes of war. Peacetime brought an abrupt change in passenger traffic on the North Atlantic. In 1920, Congress passed the Dillingham Immigration Restriction Act, cutting off the hordes of immigrants who had filled the ship's humblest quarters. Deprived of their most profitable clients, the steamship companies lured a new mass passenger instead, American tourists. Former immigrant space was dressed up, just like this modest little cabin for four on the SS Albert Baleen. A coat of paint, a company bedspread, and presto changeo, a new class, tourist third cabin. It had something for everyone. Tourist implied travel and adventure, third promised economy, and cabin added a stamp of respectability. It was a shrewd marketing move and immensely popular, appealing to college students, middle and even working class Americans who were suddenly enabled to cross the Atlantic inexpensively. It was scarcely luxurious. Passengers who were absolute strangers slept head to head in upper and lower berths. There was one faucet, probably cold, 4 very thin towels, baths by appointment only, 1 spiky potted palm, and a tatty carpet stool. Nevertheless, it all worked. Tourist third cabin became almost chic and was known popularly as the white-collar steerage. And for the first time, overwhelming numbers of Americans traveled eastbound on the North Atlantic. Thanks to tourist third cabin, 80% of the traffic was American, a proportion that has remained in effect to this day. Publicity was not very sophisticated. This White Star advertisement shows a pair of first-class passengers taking their ease before Mevez's manorial smoking room chimney on the Majestic. But the photographer has illuminated the scene with such a stunning display of firelight that he has revealed the scuffed work shoes and turned-up trousers of his passengers. They're no more than off-duty stewards serving as models. But no one seemed to care, and the great ships were booked heavily. It was known as the Atlantic Ferry, a year-round business in fair weather or foul, and it was mostly foul. The Majestic departed New York on a cold January evening. There are 2 inches of slush underfoot, and a menacing winter sky gives promise of unpleasant conditions once she has cleared the Narrows. This was no fair-weather cruise. It was, quite literally, the only way to cross. Air service would not begin for 2 decades. Passengers who were afraid of the sea or subject to motion sickness never risked a winter crossing at all. Here is a typical deck scene, a photograph taken on board the Mauretania before World War I. Apart from the difference in clothes, it might have been taken yesterday. For what we do on board ship today is precisely what our parents and grandparents did in years past. The group by the smoking room windows is exchanging ship's gossip. Who won the mileage pool, perhaps, or who was seen with whom last night in the lounge. Approaching are a pair of boat deck hazards, the walkers. We tend to have joggers today, but the walkers are of the same breed. 5 times around the Mauretania's deck was a mile, and purists used to carry 5 coins in a right-hand pocket, transferring them one by one to the left each time they swung past the veranda cafe at the stern. They walked on, regardless that they have just disrupted a shuffleboard game, or that the reverberations of their stout walking shoes might awaken late-morning occupants of cabins nearby. And in the lifeboat, Cunard crewmen continue their rounds of ceaseless maintenance that kept those Western Ocean mailboats in such spotless condition. So passenger life on any ship of any period tends to be similar, whether it was a game of deck tennis on the afterdecks of the Aquitania or deck tennis on the boat deck of the Majestic. A young passenger dressed in a sailor suit exchanges a word with a crewman similarly dressed. There were boxing matches on the Berengaria. These same gloves were used by the Berengaria's most famous passenger in the 20s, the young Prince of Wales, who crossed twice in the course of an American visit, tactfully patronizing Cunard westbound and the White Star Line eastbound. On the Imperata before World War I, a children's stewardess supervises a group of first-class passengers. There was also a sandbox that deck stewards learned to loathe, for they had to sweep sand off the decks each evening. But for adults, there were almost too many games, perhaps dating from the time when German companies tried convincing their seasick passengers that violent exercise might make them feel better. The idea, too, was to provide facilities in mid-ocean that duplicated those to be found on either shore. Shuffleboard, based on an original game called shoveboard, is the granddaddy of all seagoing deck sports and was played on every ship. On the France, le bowling was offered, although how many strikes could be expected on a vessel that rolled so abominably is hard to envision. Skeet shooting occupied the gentlemen, but ladies were perfectly willing to lend their hand in a tug of war. Large ships could do justice to more elaborate games. There was a full-size tennis court between the funnels of the Normandy. French ships had other activities as well, particularly for thirsty Americans who, eastbound, were fleeing the strictures of prohibition. On the Lafayette, bellboys were given lessons for key English phrases. Good morning, sir. Where is the bar? And how to pronounce essential like dry martini in Manhattan. But there was also miniature golf on the Ile-de-France, or, for the more athletically inclined, fun below decks in the Rotterdam's pool, either swimming races or bathing suit competitions or both. For the sedentary, there were deck chairs, to which obliging stewards brought tea trays every afternoon on the Berengaria. Afternoon tea was a little warmer under cover of the Ile-de-France's promenade deck. But the true deck chair aficionados felt that they belonged out of doors, facing the elements, bundled up in what was called a steamer rug. It was almost impossible not to strike up a conversation with one's neighbor, similarly shrouded, and professional gamblers who worked the liners knew this well. The moment they boarded, they would bribe deck stewards for deck chairs near rich, unaccompanied male passengers, thereby initiating a chance encounter that would lead inevitably to some ruinous card games. Dogs were taken on board, in the old days put in charge of the ship's butcher. On the Queen Mary, there were specially constructed kennels up on the sports deck, and bellboys used to walk them daily. On the Aquitania in 1933, there was even a dog show. There was dancing at tea and after dinner in the lounge of the Majestic. If there was a shortage of dancing partners for young ladies of the first class, pursers used to recruit discreetly in the second or even tourist third cabin for presentable undergraduates who had been clever enough to bring along a dinner jacket, that vital passport to upward mobility on board ship. Sometimes near port, there was dancing on the deck, too. Passengers on the Aquitania, as she heads up towards the Narrows early one summer morning, share one last dance, although suited and hatted for disembarkation. These white flannel trousers sum up in one evocative image the carefree delights of a crossing. There were children's costume parties in the Berengaria's dining room at Christmas time, and costume parties for grown-ups on every ship. These entrants have borrowed a steward's tea trolley and turned it into an ice cream wagon. In later years on American ships, grown-ups disliked dressing up, and the vestigial remnant of transatlantic fancy dress on the United States was the funny hat competition, won here by a rather lazy woman who has merely inverted a Bergdorf Goodman's hat box and dressed it up with flowers. But in the old days, members of the Atlantic Conference, a self-regulating organization of all the shipping companies, forbade any cabaret on board their ships at all, so that passenger entertainment was largely a matter of home-brewed fun, traditionally games, quizzes, competition, amateur concerts, and the like. Passengers were summoned to meals on board British ships by a bugler. Here is the Megantic's bugler posing for the photographer on deck in New York. The roast beef of Old England would be played to summon both sittings to dinner. Prior to the bugle, a boy in buttons would parade up and down the corridors, thundering on a large Chinese gong, the signal for first-class passengers to struggle into evening dress and black tie. When it was the only way to cross, celebrities were included on the passenger list of every crossing. Here are Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, happy on the Olympic as the White Star caption puts it, Fairbanks was also happy later on the New Amsterdam. Dorothy Parker enjoyed the Normandy, and Elmo Pickerel, the Leviathan's wireless operator, used to pose his celebrated passengers next to a life ring. Among them, the ballet dancer Pavlova with her Boston Bull, as well as a dapper Yasha Heifetz. Jackie Coogan was a famous passenger in the 30s. When ships entered New York Harbor, a tug full of reporters and photographers would board down off Staten Island, and after some liquid refreshment offered by the obliging purser, would roam the ship for an hour while she steamed up to the piers, hunting out a celebrity or two to pose for the afternoon editions. Two such VIPs were this pair, not Alvin Karpis or Ma Barker, but Sir Noel Coward and his mother, arriving on the Olympic in the late 20s and dragged out on deck for a too-early morning photograph in front of the smoking room door. Sir Noel was kind enough to give me permission to use his photograph sight unseen from Lausanne, where he was living in retirement. I think if he had seen it, it might have hastened him into an earlier grave. At the end of a westbound crossing on the New York piers, passengers submitted to the ordeal of passing through U.S. customs. Although the photographer subconsciously has cut off the heads of the inspectors, he has left intact the evocative spectacle of a disgruntled passenger rooting through his trunk for some queried purchase, while his wife, no help at all, laughs in the background. Across the ocean, Southampton during almost any day in the 20s and 30s might look like this, 3- and 4-funnel silhouettes from pre-World War I that for generations of schoolboys, illustrators and travelers signified the lure of an ocean crossing. Once disembarked, travelers entered the cheerful maelstrom of the boat-train platform, and a melee of baggages from Claridge's and the Savoy, Thomas Cook's men meeting anxious American clients, and even a film unit on location. Then it was onto the boat train for a swift, comfortable run up to London and Waterloo Station's Platform 11, the beginning and end of so many millions of transatlantic passages.
The Norway doesn't have promenade decks in the old sense. Instead, it has two shopping avenues, Champs-Élysées on this side, and on the other side, on the port side, Fifth Avenue. Our grandparents who were passengers would have been astonished at this because don't forget that less than 50 years ago, passengers on ships bought their souvenirs from the ship's barber and improvised their own entertainment of an evening. Steamship historians tend to like the good old days, but I see this as a vast improvement and applaud NCL's decision to make this ship a self-contained resort. What's happened is that the vessel we're on is no longer just merely a means of transportation. It's a floating resort as well. But then it doesn't surprise me that this is successful because I've always believed that the best islands in the Caribbean have propellers anyway. I will be discussing the design of ships' public rooms in this program, and nothing could be more appropriate than to introduce it from the Club International. Here is all the glamour of the past, whether it was, as it was on the France, a first-class smoking room, or reminiscent of dozens of vaulted, majestic interiors from any number of North Atlantic predecessors. Every ship needs a room of this kind, and it is one of the design omissions of the second Queen Elizabeth that there is nowhere a room late at night to have a drink in such splendid surroundings. Surely this is what ocean travel is all about. Impeccable service, unobtrusive good taste, a double-height ceiling, and potted palms that on the North Atlantic would have swayed and trembled with the weather outside. It was a look, moreover, at which the French excelled, as we shall see.
It was the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or French line, that put the first post-war ship in service. She was the Ile de France, about the size of the Titanic, at 46,000 tons, and from the outside a conventional vessel. The French never built identical trios of ships, but enlarged their flagships by about 10,000 tons, as soon as expansion in their home port of Le Havre allowed greater tonnage. Here are two consecutive French ships, the Paris of 1916 and the larger Ile-de-France of 1927. Similar, but very different inside. The Ile made her maiden voyage in the summer of 1927, and once in New York, after a welcome by the Department of Sanitation band playing from the cutter Macomb, attracted hordes of visitors anxious to see her new public rooms. This was her Grand Salon, which, although fairly tame by present-day standards, was the last word in 1927. Up to that time, it had been popular practice for steamship public rooms to duplicate period rooms elsewhere. The George Washington's first-class smoking room, for instance, built within a year of the Ile, had the look of an Adirondack hunting lodge. On the France of 1912, there was an attempt at a formal chateau. The Mauritania's first-class dining room was a Tudor marvel 3 stories high, while on the Paris, Art Nouveau prevailed. But the Ile-de-France's lounge was something quite new, very much by design. Jean d'Alpiaz, who headed the French line at the time the Ile-de-France was to be decorated, had set the watchword. Vivre, ce n'est pas copier, c'est créer. To live is not to copy, but to create. So every shred of fabric, every grill, capital, railing, motif, and curlicue on the Ile was perforce created arbitrarily from scratch. Of course, those with a knowing eye noted a direct influence from the Salon des Arts Décoratifs of Paris of 1925, first evidence of the geometrical neo-Egyptian design that would surface full force in the 30s and be called for short Art Deco. Hence, the Ile-de-France was a watershed in interior design, a point from which ship designers looked forward rather than backwards. It led, in fact, to something called le style paquebot, or steamship style, and there's not a vessel afloat anywhere in the world since 1927 that does not owe something of her look to the Ile-de-France. Two ships most immediately part of the Ile-de-France's influence were the 2 German challengers of the North German Lloyd, the Bremen and Europa. The Bremen appeared first because the Europa sustained a fire during her fitting out and sank up to her strength deck, setting back construction by a year and a half. So it was left for the Bremen to wrest the blue ribbon away from the aging Mauritania in 1929. The competition dating back to 1907 had come full circle again with the Germans out in front. But the German hold on the blue ribbon lasted only a few years. In 1933, the Italian line fielded a new pair of champions, the Rex and the Conte di Savoia. Once again, the Conte di Savoia looked conventional enough from outside, but her interiors were startling. A bizarre combination of styles where El Morocco zebra-striped upholstery met Villa Borghese. It is worth recalling that even to the present day, ships designed for the North Atlantic are never allowed to look like ships. In order to comfort their passengers on this most dangerous ocean, it was the custom to trick up the interiors with as many columns, tapestries, wrought iron grills, paneling, any land-based appurtenances, all to convince vulnerable and often seasick passengers that they were not at sea at all, but spending a long weekend in an English country house or a provincial chateau, or even an Adirondack hunting lodge. This steamship poster, perhaps the most widely reproduced in the world, was commissioned by the French line in the 30s to publicize their new flagship. She was one of a kind. Neither the France, the Paris, nor even the Ile-de-France had anticipated her revolutionary good looks. The Normandy was the first of the 1,000-foot liners, of which only 4 have ever been built: the Normandy, the France, and the first 2 Queens. They were the apogee of shipbuilding bulk, so expensive that government subsidies were required to complete them. Conceived in the heady optimism of the late 20s before the crash, the Normandy and Queen Mary were both completed despite a depression that reduced passenger revenues alarmingly during the period of their construction. But the Normandy should be remembered less for her improbability or extravagance than her incredible design, a look that would have survived the 50s and 60s with ease. Atlantic liners have a normal life expectancy of 30 years. Their creators must devise a scheme of interior design that will seem fresh for 3 decades, as well as an exterior silhouette that will continue to attract a notoriously fickle clientele. The Norman's designers succeeded on both counts. Even from afar, she was a paradigm of style. In her fitting-out basin at Saint-Nazaire, she boasted a raked clipper stem, first on the Atlantic since the 19th century. 3 ovoid funnels, each with a dashing 10-degree rake, receded in height to convey a subtle impression of speed. The afterdecks had all the cosmetic perfection of a Busby Berkeley movie set. Imagine a coat of black lacquer spread over that teak and one almost expected Ruby Keeler, Dick Powell, and a large chorus to materialize out of thin air. Between the funnels was a broad, uncluttered expanse of open deck, with all the ship's conventional sinews swept out of sight. This cleanness of design was in marked contrast to the identical space on the Mauretania of 30 years earlier, where a forest of guy wires, ventilators, blowers, and skylights obscures the vista. Below decks, the Normandy's interiors profited from a principle of construction pioneered on the Vaterland back in 1914. The uptakes, the chimneys, if you will, connecting boiler and funnel, were divided towards either side of the hull, permitting the designers to fashion a series of central public rooms amidships that led from one to the other in the tradition of Versailles. This simile is particularly appropriate in the Normandy's salle à manger, or dining room, a chamber exceeding Versailles' Hall of Mirrors in length. It too was sheathed in fireproof, maintenance-free glass, liberally gilded. The gastronomic indulgence permissible therein rivaled the architectural delights, and a corps of French-line cooks posed here proudly on the Normandy's smoking room staircase contributed their incomparable skills. The dining room was achieved from the grand hall, the entrance concealed here by handsome bronze doors. The swimming pool was 100 feet long, a paradise of gold mosaic, complete with shelving beach for cautious bathers. A French-line photographer has organized a platoon of models into an elaborate charade of gaiety. It's always amusing to separate contrived passengers from the genuine article, and I prefer to see the Normandy's pool filled with real passengers in mid-ocean. It was a moment, incidentally, in the evolution of bathing attire of a curiously inverted propriety, when women were experimenting with bare midriffs and gentlemen weren't quite sure. Those who came to watch were typical of the clients that seemed drawn to the Normandy. She attracted a kind of Fellini-esque haute monde, as sinister and mysterious an assemblage as had ever booked on one compelling ship before. Of course, she carried thousands of perfectly ordinary transatlantic travelers as well, but always, it seemed, with a handful of gangsters and eccentrics thrown in for good measure. The Grand Salon was similarly sheathed with an enormous glass mural, panels of which now fetch enormous sums at auction houses. The room was furnished with dozens of elaborate fauteuils upholstered in Aubusson tapestry. Adjoining it was a fumoir, or smoking room, a sober assemblage of traditional brown leather club chairs. The two contrasting spaces could be joined for special occasions into one vast chamber by the operation of electrical sliding doors. Aft, one ascended a staircase to the Normandy's extra-tariff restaurant called a grill, which served meals on request all day and as a nightclub late at night. Outside, the grill gave onto an elaborate esplanade, where first-class strollers were separated from the second by high-backed zigzag benches. In the base of the third dummy funnel, an elaborate kennel was equipped with a New York City hydrant as well as a Parisian lamppost. All this grandeur was ready to be unveiled to the public in May of 1935, when the Normandy set sail from her builders at Saint-Nazaire to her home port of Le Havre. It is interesting to see how cleverly the line of white paint along the Normandy's strength deck transcends the line of plating near the bow and rises up to a fine point, accentuating her clip-up prow. On the bridge, over 100 feet wide, the helmsman stood on an ash grating, used traditionally on sailing vessels to keep his feet dry, even though on the Normandy he stood more than 70 feet above the nearest wave. At sea, the Normandy behaved refreshingly like any steamer. She was, in the words of one Annapolis observer, a stiff, snappy roller, returning to the vertical with the resiliency of a destroyer. Life on board offered all the traditional dividends of a crossing: tea in a promenade deck chair, a new play in the theatre, dancing in the gallery, and the devoted ministrations of a newly uniformed staff that numbered 1,200. Stewards on board ships eat on the run, and in the cruise mess the inward curve of the hull betrays its location up near the Normandy's bow. A large sea-going wine cellar contributed to the pleasures of that triumphant maiden voyage, the first time that a French vessel had ever won the coveted blue ribbon. Arriving in New York, she was also the first liner to use the super piers on West 50th Street, especially built to dock the 1,000-footers. This time, as opposed to the arrival of the Olympic back in 1911, the port of New York was ready. The Normandy tied up at Pier 88, the berth that would see her arrival and departure for the next 4 years, as well as her tragic destruction. This was the Normandy's great competitor of the mid-30s. For a long time, she was known only as John Brown Hull No. 534, and for a year during her construction, all work ceased. Cunard had a cash flow problem. Passenger revenues were down, and the yard was ordered closed. Flocks of Clydeside pigeons nested in the rusting girders of the uncompleted hull. But a government subsidy was passed in Parliament on condition that Cunard and White Star, the traditional British rivals, join forces to complete the new ship. Work proceeded, and Cunard White Star flooded the press with awesome details. Remember how the Duchess of Roxburgh had driven through the funnels of the Mauretania in a motor car? The Queen Mary's funnels, it was reported, could accommodate 3 locomotives, or, if you preferred, Cunard's original ship, the Britannia. The choice of a name was delayed until the day of her launch. There is an apocryphal story that Lord Roydon, a company director, while shooting grouse with King George V in Scotland, asked His Majesty if the new ship could be named after England's greatest queen. He had had Victoria in mind. His Majesty is supposed to have replied that he would ask her as soon as he went home to Balmoral for tea. The story is charming but untrue. It seems scarcely likely that a name ending in Cunard's IA would have been a tactful choice for those White Star members of the board. In any event, Her Majesty gave her consent, and on September 26, 1934, cut the launch cord that sent the new vessel down the ways. Her empty hull alone weighed as much as a completed Mauretania. Such was the friction between oak and pine that the ways burst into flame, and the fire department had to be summoned to extinguish the blaze. Her interiors were no more innovative than her profile, which was in fact nothing more than an enlarged Aquitania. Unkind critics called the Queen Mary's public rooms a riot of Leicester Square cinema. She was full of exotic veneers, cabins and corridors drummed and chattered with vibrating panels of wood. One of her proudest installations was Queen Mary's personal standard that occupied a glass case on the main staircase. In the first-class dining room, little illuminated models of both queens traversed this Atlantic mural, keyed to the ship's crossing times. On the promenade deck, there was a nice touch of British elegance, a discreet notice indicating that 3 times around was a mile, and that the record for running it was held by Lord Burleigh, who ran, it was recorded, in full evening dress. Shortly after her maiden voyage, the Queen Mary took the blue ribbon from the Normandy. She was undeniably faster, although it must be reported that she had 40,000 more horsepower at her disposal. This aerial photograph shows the Normandy on trials off Brittany, and in the words of one Breton fisherman who survived her wake, she seemed to skim over the water like a gull. The same view of the Mary betrays incredible turbulence along the hull. Those 14 lozenge-shaped windows along the after end of the upper deck mark the location of the Veranda Grill, the Queen Mary's extra-tariff restaurant, which turned out to be such a popular rendezvous that it was decided to include its duplicate on board the Queen Elizabeth. Indeed, days after the Mary was launched, hull number 552 was laid down in her place. Cunard White Star's weekly service to New York would now be effected by 2 ships the size and speed of the Queen's. Each week, one would depart from Southampton and one from New York. Samuel Cunard's regular weekly service was a North Atlantic tradition. In 1840, it had required 4 ships, and in 1907, 3. Now it could be sustained with an irreducible minimum of 2. The Queen Elizabeth was launched by a new young queen in 1938. But before she was fitted out, another world war intervened, and the Elizabeth became a Clydeside liability, a tempting target for any Luftwaffe bomber that might penetrate that far north. Hence, in one of the most successful ruses of the war, the brand new ship sailed in secret for New York. She had had no engine trials or dry docking, and portions of her launch gear were still attached to the hull. Her entire complement consisted of a scratch crew from the Aquitania and a dozen technicians from John Brown's yard. She arrived unheralded one March morning in New York Harbor and tied up on the north side of Pier 90. For a fortnight, the 3 largest liners in the world were together. From left to right, the newly arrived Elizabeth, the Mary already in gray war paint, and the Normandy languishing at Pier 88, a New York Harbor captive since the outbreak of hostilities in September of 1939. Then the Queens were off on the urgent business of war. The luxurious fittings were put into storage in Halifax, and the 2 liners became troop ships, once again performing the same specialized function for which they had been designed, the transportation of large numbers of passengers at high speed. But these were incredible numbers. The record was nearly 17,000 carried on one crossing. During the summer, entire regiments slept on deck, and those lucky enough to have a berth below could only use it for half the day. Then a replacement took over. Continuous meals were served in a dining room filled with steel mess tables. GIs who had finished breakfast would start lining up again for lunch. The splendid proportions of the ship's main shopping square were awash with khaki. The 2 Queens traveled alone, too fast for any convoy, and never followed the same route twice. It was rumored that Hitler promised any U-boat commander an Iron Cross and a fortune if he could sink one of the Queens, but not one torpedo ever came close. Winston Churchill estimated that the work of the 2 ships shortened the war by a year. But the Normandy stayed put until December 8, 1941. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt ordered her seized and transformed into the troop ship USS Lafayette. The conversion contract was awarded to the Todd shipyard, and 3,000 dock workers swarmed over the ship. All work would be completed at Pier 88 before the ship was scheduled for dry docking in Boston. The Grand Salon, seen here during a peacetime gala, was turned into the main troop recreation compartment. Carpeting would come up and linoleum would go down. 4 decorative lamps, towering glass cascades, were to be cut down, their bases to serve as table supports. The glass was removed, and on the morning of February 9, 1942, a cutting crew began removing the steel tripods that remained. Their work was made harder because the day previous, 10,000 epoch life preservers had been delivered on board and dumped into the Grand Salon for stenciling before being distributed to cabins below. Epoch is an oil-impregnated, highly inflammable substance, and the life jackets were wrapped, 10 to a bundle, in tarred paper with a protective layer of new burlap. The first 3 tripods were removed successfully, but on the 4th and last one, the man charged with containing the sparks within an asbestos sheet moved away a fraction of a second too early, and a shower of white-hot metal fragments fell onto the burlap of the life preserver bales around the base. In a moment, it was alight. A ghastly kind of Marx Brothers comedy ensued. Men tried beating the flames out with coats and hats. Others threw burning bales aside, inadvertently spreading the flames. One man ran in with 2 buckets of water, tripped and fell. Another man ran out to the promenade deck and unreeled a new U.S. Navy hose, but its coupling was incompatible with the French hydrant. A man on the bridge tried summoning the fire department, but the special alarm button he pressed had been disconnected 2 weeks earlier. Unchecked, the fire spread to the walls. It was a bitterly cold morning. Fireboats, first on the scene, nosed into the ice of the slip between piers 88 and 90 and started pumping tons of water up to where they saw smoke. But their hoses couldn't penetrate to the Grand Salon, only through shattered promenade deck windows where the water was retained by blocked scuppers. Melted lead from electrical conduits had plugged the drains. The fire burned steadily, sending poisonous clouds of smoke over the city that by dusk had reached the far boundary of Suffolk County. The same smoke engulfed the engine room within 15 minutes, drawn down through ventilating trunks. The ship was evacuated, her vital systems inoperable. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Normandy had achieved what the Navy termed a safe list of 16 degrees. Fireboats continued their deadly barrage, pouring superfluous water aloft, some of which showered back into the harbor, but some of which stayed on board, adding tons of critical top weight. Several large ports, double doors really, in the hull shell plating, remained open, dangerously near the waterline, but no attempt was made to close them as the ship continued her inexorable list. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the fire was out, and a photographer on board took a picture of the derelict interior up the smoking room staircase. On the bridge, the firewall had held, though badly charred, and the Normandy's wheel was still intact. When I was researching the only way to cross, I found the wheel in a New Jersey warehouse, bought it from the diver who had stolen it, and presented it to the South Street Seaport Museum in New York, where it is on display to this day. At midnight, the tide turned. 2.5 hours later, the Normandy rolled over in her slip like a giant discarded bathtub toy. The Navy removed the armaments that had already been installed on the stern and then set about the work of refloating her. It cost $5 million and consumed 18 months of indescribable labor. Everything above the strength deck was cut away. This view was taken from the top of Pier 90 to the north. Every porthole, opening, and hatch below water was patched. Working in water so filthy that they could see nothing, divers divided up the hull into 16 watertight compartments, which were pumped dry in delicate sequence until finally, agonizingly slowly, the Normandy rolled upright. The pumping operation alone took 6 weeks, and when the job was complete, the hull, bearing the growth rings of her ascent from the harbor, was towed to Brooklyn and dry docking. It was already autumn of 1943, and the Navy decided that further renovation that late in the war was impractical. So she was scrapped, ending the life of the North Atlantic's most beautiful ship after only 70 voyages between Le Havre and New York. Had she survived the war, there is every reason to suppose that the Normandy would have remained in service as long as her famous Cunard White Star rival, the Queen Mary. When hostilities in Europe were over in the spring of 1945, one pre-war Atlantic liner changed hands. She was the Europa, only survivor of the record-breaking North German Lloyd duo of 1929. The Bremen had been sunk at her moorings by the RAF. The United States government presented the Europa to the French, some said as a replacement for the lost Normandy. She was delivered to Le Havre, where, after a severe channel storm, she broke loose from her moorings and was rammed by the sunken bow of the Paris, which had burned and capsized at her pier in 1938. The Europa sank upright, harbor water lapping at her railings, just as she had after the fire during her fitting out in Germany years earlier. But she was salvaged, towed to Saint-Nazaire, and transformed by the French into the beloved Liberté. The Aquitania, the only four-stacker to have survived both world wars, returned to Gourock after her last trooping voyage, ready to resume service on the ocean for which she had been designed. In Southampton, both queens arrived home from the war. The Elizabeth was painted in company colors for the first time, and the inbound Mary already has her funnels restored to Cunard's red and black. Finally, the Queen Elizabeth had a proper maiden voyage. So profitable was that post-war service that Congress was persuaded to authorize funds for an American superliner as well. From the start of her construction in a dry dock at Newport News, she was known as the United States, the brainchild of William Francis Gibbs, Dean of American Naval Architects. The chance to build his own brand new ship had been a 30-year obsession with Gibbs, and given his head by Congress and the Navy, he designed a handsome, fast, if slightly Spartan ship. She was designed for almost instant conversion into a troop ship. Gibbs was terrified of fire on board and liked to claim that there was no wood anywhere on the United States save for chopping blocks and pianos. As it was, he pestered Louis Steinway for months to build him an aluminum piano, but relented when Steinway promised to douse a fireproof wooden one with gasoline to show that it wouldn't burn. This picture, publicizing one of the United States' famous chopping blocks, inadvertently reveals two additional wooden items, the handle of the knife the cook is using, as well as a small scrubbing brush on the porthole's ledge. She was incredibly fast. Trials off Jamestown assured Gibbs that his dream ship would take the blue ribbon with ease. Although no speed figures were released, a fine haze of mist along the waterline indicated that the United States had extraordinary reserves of power. Later, it was estimated that she could travel in excess of 40 land miles an hour. The ship first entered her home port of New York in the summer of 1952. On July 4th, 112 years to the day since the little Britannia had sailed from Liverpool, she set out eastbound across the Atlantic. 3.5 days later, a full 12 hours faster than the defending champion, the Queen Mary, she swept past Bishop Rock Light and put into the French port of Le Havre. Once again, paint was peeling from the bow plating, sure sign of a new ship, and in this case, an imperishable new record. The United States Lines was automatically the recipient of a rather overblown memento that a British member of Parliament called Hales had fabricated in the late 20s. He headed his own firm of silversmiths and tried to enter the name Hales into North Atlantic immortality by creating a tangible relic in place of the intangibly glorious blue ribbon. On little plaques around the trophy were representations of the Britannia, the Mauretania, Rex, Normandy, and Queen Mary. But after winning the Hales Trophy in the late 30s, Cunard had mislaid it, and there was an awful flap when the United States Lines demanded possession in 1952. Today, it sits enshrined in a glass case at the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, Long Island, as unlikely ever to be removed as is the America's Cup from the New York Yacht Club's trophy room.
Here on the bridge of the Norway, commands can be transmitted direct to the engine room. By moving this simple joystick control, the captain can transmit commands to no less than 7 propellers simultaneously, either the ship's 2 main screws or 5 bow and stern thrusters, propellers housed in tunnels cut laterally through the hull. As a result, the Norway can turn on a dime or move sideways into her berth at Miami. One command you don't hear up here ever, unlike the United States, is full speed ahead. Norway can manage a respectable 25 knots if needs be, but in general, she moves much more slowly. Speed for ships of this size is academic now, and the Norway is content merely to move slowly and comfortably from island to island. When this ship was the France, her afterdecks were completely closed in. Don't forget that summer and winter as well, on the North Atlantic it was invariably cold. Outdoors North Atlantic meant maybe a stroll on the deck, warmly bundled up, maybe a rug in a deck chair, or perhaps a table in a veranda cafe, always facing aft. There was nothing like this open spread of decks on the Norway. Here you can see that passengers, even underway, can avail themselves of a swimming pool, sunbathing, even a restaurant they can eat at outdoors. The tempo on board has changed too, because passengers are no longer being carried inexorably back and forth across a dangerous ocean. In fact, there is a pleasant mood because one is drifting, a pleasurable drift, one might say, from port to port. But in the 1950s, the great ships on the North Atlantic were still thundering back and forth to Europe, and America and back again.
The Hudson River superpiers were known as luxury liner row. The post-war travel boom meant Europe, and Europe, as it always had, meant an ocean passage. It was no longer quite the only way to cross, but before the advent of jets, a transatlantic flight was a grueling 14-hour ordeal. How much pleasanter to cross on one of Cunard's Queens. Westbound began, as always, from platform 11 at London's Waterloo Station on board the boat train. At Southampton, luggage was whisked from baggage car to cabin, an ideal accommodation in which to spend 5 uninterrupted, carefree days. The beds were incredibly soft. Old-fashioned punka louvers delivered fresh or warmed ocean air, and every surface had a slightly raised edge to keep things in place. Paneling extended throughout both queens, glistening walls that would creak and chatter evocatively as the great ships heaved across the Atlantic. Paradoxically, there was nothing to do, but seldom enough time to do everything. Food and drink were, as always, an unending preoccupation. Elaborate meals in the dining room, preceded by a gathering in the smoking room. Down below, well away from cold Atlantic winds, were handsome saltwater pools, and for those who had overindulged, elaborate gymnasia, staffed by remorseless tyrants in white flannels. In the evening, there were movies or time-honored passenger amusement, horse racing, in the main lounge. But in 1957, a sinister milestone passed. Jet engines had arrived, and that year more transatlantic passengers traveled by air than by sea. It was the start of a long, fatal decline for the North Atlantic ships. In the 60s, the decline accelerated. New York's harbor entrance was spanned by the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, the world's largest, high enough to admit the tallest funnels and masts. But within a decade, most of the great ships it had been designed to accommodate would be gone. In 1969, in early middle age, 17 years after her triumphant maiden voyage, the United States was withdrawn from service, victim of a familiar American malaise, exorbitant union demands and dwindling passenger revenues. William Francis Gibbs, her designer, had died in 1967. If he hadn't, the premature demise of his beloved ship would doubtless have killed him. She was laid up in Norfolk. Now there are plans to restore her to service as a Pacific cruise ship. The withdrawal of great liners from transatlantic service has always been a matter of intense regret for crews as well as passengers. In Southampton in the 30s, ships destined for the scrapyard were consigned to the limbo of berth 108. In 1935, both Olympic and Mauretania were tied up there forever. The Mauretania had been painted white for the Caribbean cruises that kept her occupied for those final years of service. Before she went north, there was an auction of her fittings in the first-class lounge. All the famous carved mahogany paneling went as one lot. There was talk of a Mauretania hotel in New York, but nothing ever came of it, and it was used instead to decorate the Mauretania pub in Bristol. When she sailed for Scotland, her masts were cut short so that she could pass beneath the Firth of Forth Bridge. And as the great ship was warped into the Admiralty dock at Rosyth, a Highland piper played a lament, The Flowers of the Forest. The Olympic went next to Jarrow on the Tyne, and then the Berengaria. Her wiring had deteriorated during her last years on the Atlantic, and she had been plagued by a series of fires. So too perished her proud sister, the Majestic, seen here with only one of her trio of funnels remaining. The Leviathan was brought back to those same northern waters after spending too many depression years tied up at her Hoboken berth. The indescribable shambles of her derelict funnels and upper decks was soon cut away. Near the end of the Leviathan scrapping, there was buoyancy enough remaining in her floor plates to thrust the 2 inboard propellers conveniently above water for dismantling. In 1952, the Aquitania was withdrawn from the Canadian run. A Southampton police bugler played the last post on the grand old ship's after decks as the joint house flags of Cunard and White Star were lowered for the last time. Across the Channel in 1959, the Ile-de-France was sold for scrapping to the Japanese, who renamed her Furanzu Maru, literally French ship, for the voyage out to the Far East. Before she was cut up, She served as a floating set for a film called, appropriately, The Last Voyage, that still plays on late-night television. The Liberté went to an Italian scrapyard in 1962. By the late 60s, the Queens were finished as well. The two grand old ships were just that, too grand and too old. The Mary went first after an emotional send-off from New York. She returned to England for 2 short cruises to the Canary Islands and then left Southampton forever, departing on a round-the-Horn cruise that would take her past the Panama Canal, through which she was too large to fit. She tied up at Long Beach, her present home port. The offshore oil pumped out of the harbor can legitimately be used for waterfront improvement. And once her captain had rung down "finish with engines," this was what the Californians had in mind for their venerable Cunarder. She was completely restored on the outside for her new shore-bound existence. It was discovered that her deck fittings were held up largely by paint. Some of the paint chips, in fact, were made up into souvenir cufflinks. The funnels were replaced by aluminum facsimiles and the rusted originals left lying on their side on the pier. Before you could say Mauritania, incredulous Californians were paying $1 apiece for the privilege of driving their cars through the Queen Mary's funnels. The ancient appeal of vehicles through funnels continued to the bitter end. The Queen Elizabeth sailed on alone, but she had a new consort, the France, which had been built on the same ways at Saint-Nazaire that had seen construction of the Normandy. Curiously, the French line played their last trump card at an inopportune moment. The year her keel was laid, in 1957, the appalling ascendancy of the jets had begun. The France was launched in May of 1960 by Yvonne de Gaulle, wife of the legendary French president. The new French line flagship was fitted out for the next year and a half. Although the France had none of the Normandy's daring, her profile was just as distinctive. 2 enormous cheminées à ailerons, funnels with wings, surmounted the aluminum superstructure. The role of a funnel on board ship is twofold: to remove smoke from the upper decks and to ensure instant identification. The France's funnels were effective on both counts, and they were unmistakable for miles. Like the Normandy, she was staffed with abandon, 1,200 in crew to look after 1,800 passengers. She entered Le Havre for the first time after Christmas of 1961, passing her superannuated older sister, the Liberté. A month later, in February of 1962, she arrived in New York Harbor on her maiden voyage. Although the French line didn't know it, their last dozen years of passenger service had begun. The Queen Elizabeth retired to Fort Lauderdale. She sailed from Southampton and tied up amidst the unreal green of Florida's coast. Regretfully, there was no oil to pay the bills, no visitors in any quantity, and an unsavory real estate scandal that placed the famous liner in the midst of controversy. Within 2 years, she was bought by a Hong Kong shipping magnate called C.Y. Tung. He changed the Queen Elizabeth's name to an acronym of his own first 2 initials. C.Y. became C.Y.'s University. Despite a series of catastrophic boiler failures, she limped east to Hong Kong. There, $6 million was spent refitting her. But on the morning of a reception celebrating the completion of renovations, several fires broke out simultaneously along A-Deck's port alleyway. In spite of the heroic efforts of her crew and Hong Kong's fire department, she burned through the night, sinking on her starboard side, a complete loss. I visited Hong Kong in 1973, a year after the fire, and hired a junk to inspect the wreck. It was a sad sight. A beautiful ship on which I had sailed many times lay twisted, rusting, and derelict. She has since been cut up for scrap. For better or for worse, the Queen Mary is still with us. If not quite a ship, at least as the world's largest floating exhibit. No vessel approaching her size has ever been retained intact. As each year goes by, the Queen Mary accumulates evocative value. Ultimately, she will remain the sole surviving express liner in benevolent captivity, a tribute to the skill of Scottish shipwrights and a fond recall of a vanished transatlantic standard. What else is left? Nothing of the Queen Elizabeth but luggage labels and souvenirs. The Aquitania's bell hangs in the QE2's wardroom, where it is used as a boisterous means of ringing in each new year. There are pieces of Normandy all over the United States. Baudry's statue of La Normandie that stood atop the smoking room staircase can be found today next to the bar at Miami's Fontainebleau Hilton. Another tunicked bronze lady from the Normandy called Peace that loomed over the captain's table in the first-class dining room presides now over a Normandy corner of the Pinehurst Cemetery in Farmingdale, Long Island. The double doors that gave access from the Normandy's Grand Hall into the dining room were cut down to fit the portals of Our Lady of Lebanon Church in Brooklyn. Portions of the glass murals from the Normandy's public rooms have been offered for sale on several occasions. A cluster of them is on permanent display in New York's Metropolitan Museum, together with some first-class dining room chairs. One Normandy relic not in the United States is what I can only describe as a merman, which was originally commissioned as the focus of the first-class esplanade aft of the grill. But it proved too heavy for the deck and remains to this day parked on the pier at Le Havre. It was the Rotterdam of 1959, fifth of the Holland-America Line's vessels to bear that proud name, that inaugurated new deck configurations for combined crossing and cruising. Prior to her appearance, transatlantic vessels had vertical boundaries between classes. First class was always amidships, away from propeller vibration, at a point in the hull where sea motion was minimized. Second and third classes made do fore and aft in areas of descending desirability. But with one-class cruising on the horizon, the Rotterdam's designers incorporate a sandwich of decks running the length of the ship, each devoted to one class, first above, tourist below. With a minimum of fuss, all transatlantic class barriers could be removed for single-class cruising. This sensible Dutch arrangement set a new design standard and would be echoed on the Canberra, France, and QE2. The Queen Elizabeth II was the final great ship built at John Brown's yard on the Clyde. The new ship's first steel was laid at No. 4 building berth on July 2nd, 1965. It was symptomatic of modern shipbuilding techniques that instead of a single girder, a prefabricated keel section was lowered symbolically into place. She would be a lighter and more economical queen, entirely welded, to be driven by only 2 propellers, and with upper decks of aluminum that could safely be added while she was still on dry land. Until her launch, she was known only as Hull No. 736. Queen Elizabeth christened her on the 20th of September, 1967, 61 years to the day after the Mauretania's entry into the River Tyne. Her Majesty cut the launch cord with the same golden scissors with which her mother and grandmother had launched the 2 former queens. The vessel's name, a carefully guarded secret until that moment, was to have been simply Queen Elizabeth. But at the moment of christening, Her Majesty added, perhaps involuntarily, the second. There was then an agonizing delay of over a minute before the hull moved at all. But then, gathering momentum, she made up for lost time by racing down the ways at 22 knots, one of the most precipitous launches in history, half again as fast as the Queen Mary's. She operated in partnership with the France, these last 2 Atlantic giants working in the same tandem that had characterized the service of the 2 original queens. In August of 1974, I sailed home to New York on the France for what turned out to be her last westbound crossing. The price of bunker sea oil, the treacly black goo that had been almost given away before the 70s, had risen to a point where the French government was paying a $20 million annual subsidy to keep the ship in operation for a largely American clientele. Not surprisingly, President Giscard d'Estaing called a halt. Despite a futile last-minute strike by her crew, the France returned to Le Havre and was berthed in a backwater at the Quai de l'Oubli, the pier of the forgotten. It was the end of the ship, and it was also the end of over a century of impeccable French line service between Le Havre and New York. For a while, there were plans to turn the France into an offshore hotel, but mercifully they never materialized. In 1979, Knut Kloster of the Norwegian Caribbean Lines decided that a newly adapted France would serve as an invaluable flagship for his Miami fleet. Reprieve from the scrapyard was at hand, although first sight of that sleeping giant was scarcely salubrious. Visitors who explored the empty decks were soaked by a cold Channel drizzle. Nothing moved anywhere. Public rooms were shrouded and desolate, and the France seemed like a modern-day Marie Celeste, an echoing ghost ship where all life hung suspended. Could those derelict, rain-swept decks be restored to life for the sun-drenched Caribbean? NCL decided they could. France was renamed Norway, and under heavy guard to prevent sabotage by militant French dock workers, she was towed to Bremerhaven for conversion at the Hapag-Lloyd yard. Not since William Francis Gibbs had transformed Vaterland into Leviathan had an Atlantic vessel known such renovation. Tage Vonborg, a Danish naval architect who has designed more cruise ships than any man in history, was engaged to transform French puckboat into Norwegian cruise ship. The Norway went into dry dock. 2 of 4 propellers were removed and the outboard shafts permanently capped. New 5-bladed propellers of greater efficiency were installed on the inboard shafts. Thanks to this radical motive surgery, the Norway's fuel consumption was cut in half. To improve maneuverability, 5 bow and stern thrusters were added, equipment that is a sine qua non for modern cruise ships that must negotiate ports without the assistance of tugs. A coat of royal blue paint was superimposed over the scarred hull. With only 2 propellers in use, the ship's forward funnel was now redundant. Vonborg thought of removing it or replacing it with one of his own design. But Kloster's final decision was to keep both funnels as was, and happily the France's familiar profile was retained intact as the Norway. It was a sensible lesson from the past. The Ile-de-France's 3 funnels reduced to 2 had never looked right. But further aft the profile did change as Vonborg opened up the decks to the sun. The France had been designed primarily for cold weather, and her afterdecks were for the most part enclosed. To accommodate an increased passenger load, Vonborg created an overhanging lido deck that transcended the lines of the hull. He added an outdoor pool, not only in the stern, but up between the funnels as well. To do so, Vonborg employed a convenient sundeck excavation left over from the France's days on the North Atlantic. This was a sunken courtyard known as Le Patio Provençal, which had been designed to provide fresh air and daylight to inside sundeck cabins. Bremerhaven workmen dropped a prefabricated pool into the patio with portholes cut into its flanks so that the Norway's inside sundeck passengers might still enjoy a view of sorts. Below deck, Angelo Dongia, a brilliant New York interior designer, renovated all public rooms and cabins. It was a formidable task. The France's original scheme of decoration was the worst of late 50s low-tech, cold, fluorescent, and metallic. Dongia was asked to create new public rooms for the Norway that would be richly detailed, yet inviting and practical. Although he had never before been concerned with a ship's interior, Dongia succeeded admirably. Moreover, the changes he wrought offer insight into traditional North Atlantic concepts and how they must be modified for the new breed of one-class ships to come. Promenade decks date back over a century, decks where passengers can enjoy the external sea, yet be protected from the cold and damp. For the Caribbean, obviously both the France's promenade decks were unnecessary, so they were gutted, air-conditioned, and restructured. The tourist promenade was cut up into cabins, and the first class emerged as the Norway's Street of Dreams, a boulevard rather than a mall, that gave access to a series of recreated first-class public rooms. Furthest aft, in what had formerly been the France's first-class smoking room, or Salon Riviera, Dongia created the Club International, a late-night retreat for those who cannot cope with discotheque. Although some of the original French fixtures remain, a new freshness prevails. Here, a startling piece of statuary comes on board over the stern, a giddy evocation of the sea god Triton, which fills a portside niche. Yet tradition prevails as well, including a portrait of Norway's monarch, King Olaf V, who visited the ship when she called at Oslo. Amidships, the Salon Fontainebleau, the France's first-class lounge, was reworked into Chequers Cabaret, a riot of rich red upholstery, red and black carpet, and black and white checked dance floor. The Francis Theatre was known as the Salle de Spectacle and was used only for films and occasional concerts. With additional stages for live entertainment, the Saga Theatre offers even more spectacle, multimedia review and Broadway revivals. Quite a change from the days when members of the Atlantic Conference outlawed any professional entertainment whatsoever. One deck below was the Francis tourist class deck. The tourist smoking room was wrought into the Monte Carlo room, the Norway's floating casino. Gambling and cruising seemed synonymous. The tourist class lounge, the Salon Saint-Tropez, was the largest room on board the France. At Bremerhaven, an additional raised level was incorporated for better sightlines, and a commodious North Cape lounge was the end result. What's in a pool? Perhaps the most extraordinary of the Norway's Bremerhaven transformations was an ingenious use of the Francis tourist class pool, which had been a compromise facility made semi-open air by sliding glass doors at its after end. After von Borg built his outdoor pool, Dongier found a perfect use for the shell of the old one. Filled with electronic gadgets and a network of steel joists, it became an infinity lighting effect beneath the glass floor of Dazzles, the Norway's obligatory discotheque. Dancing at Sea continues, although in a style unimagined in the Berengaria's ballroom. Passengers used to board the France through the embarkation lobby amidships. Incidentally, it's interesting to note that the monochromatic carpet was a chief steward's nightmare on the France, requiring constant vacuuming. Now, the same space serves as merely a prelude to the windward dining room. In the old days, it was the restaurant Chambord, and its staircase, known appropriately as La Grande Descente, immortalized a moment when female passengers caught all eyes as they came down to dine. The room is essentially unchanged, the walls still decorated with original French murals, but with new carpets, tablecloths, and chairs to bring it up to date. The Francis tourist class dining room, called the Restaurant Versailles, needed considerably more work to bring it up to decorative parity with the Windward. Dongier's solution was to hang a chrome chandelier, as well as install a graceful spiral staircase connecting the room's two levels, affording the leeward dining room passengers their own grande descente. Yet, what seemed simple in the telling involved an overwhelming workload for thousands of specialists. Shipbuilding is at best an incredibly complex business. A conversion is sometimes worse, rather as though a well-built Norman chateau were being revamped, stone by stone, into a Floridian condominium. Over the winter, the work at Bremerhaven intensified. Snow fell and finally melted, although orange tarpaulins still shrouded the new after decks to shelter workers from the chill North Sea winds. There wasn't a square inch of the ship that did not need attention, whether the emergency steering apparatus aft in the tiller flat, recarpeting every one of the ship's cabins, putting finishing touches on new marquees, or forward on the bow, where davits for the giant shore launches were installed on the open deck. One glorious March morning, a plume of steam vented noisily from the working after funnel, indicating that the Norway's long-dormant boilers were back online again. Amidships, a new illuminated sign took shape, and there came a time in April when the captain could dispense with his winter's hard hat to reappear in uniform on a spotless bridge at new controls that would take the Finnish vessel away from Bremerhaven's grimy sprawl and out into the open sea for trials. The following month, in May of 1980, the Norway dropped anchor for the first time in Norwegian waters at the port of Kristiansand. The next morning, attended by a joyous flotilla of small craft, she started her stately journey up Oslo Fjord to the capital. The Norway tied up under the walls of the ancient Akershus, Norway's palace, and for 3 days and nights, all of Norway, it seemed, came down for a look at the ship that had taken its name. Then the Norway departed for Southampton and the start of a maiden voyage. There were 1,000 passengers on board for this historic occasion, the last chilly voyage of the new ship. If it was not quite a maiden voyage, it was certainly not a dowager's either. For me, it was a miracle of sorts to look up at the same ship's mast where, years earlier, the French tricolour had flown, and to see it now with Norwegian and United Nations flags snapping proudly in the wind. We arrived in New York Harbor on May 16th, 1980, on the eve of Norway's Independence Day, greeted appropriately by the Norwegian tall ship Christian Radich. Once under the Narrows Bridge, Manhattan's towers lay glistening in the spring sun, and the Norway tied up at Pier 88, her old berth as the France. Next morning at dawn, the Norway left New York for the last time. Passing down harbor, she met the incoming Queen Elizabeth II. As the vessels passed, the Cunardas thronged the port wing of the bridge to wish the Norway Godspeed to her new life in Miami. She arrived there on schedule in June and took up the cruising itinerary for which Gloucester had restored her to service. On the Atlantic, the Queen Elizabeth II is the only superliner that still crosses. During the summer months, she still plies that ancient route between Europe and America. Samuel Cunard started it all in 1840, and it seems very probable that Cunard will finish it in our day, but I hope not for a very long time. The QE2 spends the rest of her years on other routes, either sailing to warm weather ports or once each January departing on a world cruise. The Rotterdam, too, still circles the globe each winter. When shipping companies radio their ships at sea, they use a convenient abbreviation for the word passenger. It is PAX, P-A-X. It is also the Latin word for peace, and is, I have always felt, an eminently appropriate choice. The tonic effect of a sea voyage was a traditional Victorian cliché, but I think they were right. Certainly, passage on board a liner of any size, going anywhere, guarantees not only peace for the passenger, but a kind of rejuvenation as well.
I'm speaking to you from the Norway's playroom. During this series of programs, we've seen ships born, we've seen ships die, and we've seen ships preserved. But the most enviable way of preservation is to restore them to life, as the France has been restored to life as the glorious Norway. When ships die, they become nothing more than a collection of relics. And I have here a small vest pocket collection of relics from ships of the past. The box itself is from the Mauretania of 1909. And inside, a slightly more grisly relic, which is a replica of the medal the Germans struck when they torpedoed the Lusitania. Then, too, there is a little penknife that used to be sold on board the Vaterland, a German ship, in 1914. If you were to order a martini in the Normandy's grill room, you would find your olive impaled on this handsome little sterling silver pick. On the France, you used to buy these little watch charms. And when the France was renamed Norway, I made sure that the new name was emblazoned on the side of the ship. Finally, carrying the date of her demise, 1974, was this little gold money clip from the France. And you can see that the familiar profile of the funnels matches the mural behind me, part of the original French decoration. William Francis Gibbs, the man who designed and built the United States, used to have a favorite toast. It went as follows: to the big ship and everything you always wanted, doubled. I can do no better than share those sentiments with you, and thank you very much for taking time out of your Norway week to share with me the delights of the only way to cross.